You are listening to Action Design Radio, podcast of the Action Design Network, a globally recognized nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting all aspects of behavioral science. We bring you leading researchers and practitioners to discuss the latest behavioral science insights and how they can practically be applied to make a better world for all. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy today's episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm your host, Zarak Khan. With me as always, also your host, Erik Johnson. Hey, Erik.
Hey, Zarak, and hello, listeners.
And we are very excited to welcome back to the show, Linnea Gandhi. Linnea, thanks for being with us.
Thank you both for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, we are always excited to talk with you, and our listeners are always excited to hear from you because you're doing such interesting things. So as a quick reminder to everybody, Linnea is a researcher, a teacher, practitioner. I feel like every time I chat with you, you're up to some new and interesting venture. And so we're going to talk about several of those today. And in addition to sort of your academic work as a researcher, you teach at University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. You have your own consulting firm, BehavioralSight. You're doing your Ph.D. at Wharton with Angela Duckworth. And then in your spare time, you have launched this course on noise that's sort of in conjunction with or in partnership with Daniel Kahneman and Olivier Sibony and Cass Sunstein, who just published this book, Noise, which you helped organize as well. So, and other interesting projects.
Let's not forget about the puppies.
I know.
Exactly. And raising two adorable puppies, which I saw make an appearance on some pretty great promo videos for this Noise.
We'll dig into that.
Yeah. So Linnea does it all, and we're excited to spend some time chatting with you today.
Man, you guys are too nice. Can you introduce me in all of my meetings?
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Yeah, exactly.
You can just record this and play it as a video whenever you
pause. Yeah.
Well, I'm all about the just live on the fly. So somebody asked when we published our, Linnea also contributed a chapter to our book that we published about building behavioral science in an organization. So she wrote about sort of this kind of integrated model of behavioral science teams. And somebody asked about that book. They were like, oh, are you going to do an audiobook? They were like, I think I bought the first copy. Are you going to do an audiobook? And I was like, well, if you bought the first copy, I'll just text me whenever you want, and I'll just call you and read it out loud to you. So I'll make the same offer to you, Linnea. Whenever you need an introduction somewhere, just text me and I'll dial in and introduce you.
I love it. Thanks, Zarak.
So, maybe let's start with the thing that is sort of across all the headlines, the behavioral science headlines these days, which is noise. And I remember coming across this a few years ago, I think, in an article in HBR that you co-authored with Daniel Kahneman and a couple other folks. And I remember thinking, this is a really interesting topic. I especially remember thinking about it like in the context of being a behavioral scientist and like designing interventions. And I remember thinking, man, I work with a lot of talented people. And if you brought this problem to any one of us, we'd probably design pretty different solutions to it. But maybe for the sake of listeners and for the sake of folks who haven't read the book yet, can you give us a quick introduction to noise and as a way of starting to talk about this course that you designed as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks. So I think the best way to talk about noise is in contrast to the term bias, which I'm guessing most of your listeners are really familiar with being interested in behavioral science. The noise and bias they're technically statistical concepts. Psychologists kind of borrowed them from statistics and they've run from there. Statistically, bias is just a shift that's shared away from the mean or away from what is right or what is true or what is accurate. So if you imagine a target that you're aiming arrows at, this is the iconic symbol of the book, you would see all of the arrows fly to the left or all of the arrows fly down, right? There would be this shared shift away from the center of the target. That's bias. What noise is the spread. So if you had people shooting in that target and those arrows go all over the place, we're seeing spread, scatter. That's what noise is. It's often unexplained variability in judgment. So bias is sort of a shared deviation. It's often explained, right? We have a name for it. We can usually explain what's driving it: overconfidence, ease of recall, anchoring. But noise, it's that error term. It's the standard deviation in the data. And that's what this book is really trying to shed a lot of light on. And the course is trying to help explain in sort of a simplified, interactive way.
And for the folks that, I mean, I think you're totally spot on that a lot of the listeners here are going to be very familiar with cognitive biases and have spent a lot of time thinking about that. Obviously, one of the lead authors of this book, Daniel Kahneman, has spent a lot of time thinking about that too. Why should people who have spent a lot of time thinking about cognitive biases start to think about noise as well?
Well, because they're actually far more related than you'd think. And this, honestly, I remember when we were working on the book, Danny saying, I can't believe I've spent a whole career studying psychological bias and its manifestation as shared deviations, shared error. And I really haven't been focusing on all the scatter and the spread. And there's actually this nice relationship between psychological bias and noise that we often don't attend to, mostly because when we write papers, whether you're an academic or you're a practitioner, designing interventions, we're focusing on that shift to the average. That's what an effect size is often looking at. It's looking at how many standard deviations away from, your control are you actually shifting behavior. The focus is so much on that statistical shift. But if you think about psychological bias, it can actually drive spread as well. So an example you might think about is anchoring, right? We know that if you have a high anchor and a low anchor, those are going to shift you in two different directions. If I give you a low anchor, you are systematically going to give me a lower number, let's say in a negotiation or in counting the number of jelly beans in a jar. If I give you a high anchor, you are systematically going to have a higher guess or estimate of the number of jelly beans in the jar or a negotiated price. But in reality, in life, when people are going through these estimation exercises or going through negotiations, their anchors differ, right? Zarak, you might have an anchor from just looking at a different house or looking at a different bag of candy than Erik does, which means you're both susceptible to anchoring, but Erik might happen to have a lower anchor than you. And so if we look at your data, yeah, you have a systematic shift in the direction of your anchor, but because they're different, it turns into spread when we pool your data together. And that is the noise that's actually often all around us that's actually driven by psychological biases.
So when you're thinking about kind of operationalizing this or like kind of putting it into practice, I think maybe even in that article a few years ago, you introduced the idea of like a noise audit, where people can sort of go in and start to kind of measure this, or maybe even just sort of elevate the measurement that's already happening to start to design, some kind of change around it. What's been your experience so far? Like, the reaction from people when you sort of bring this up? I mean, anecdotally, I think of like variability when you get to sort of like frontline operations of a big organization, right? So let's say like a bureaucracy, and you look at, say you're like waiting in line at the DMV and you see like, oh, there's one line that's moving a lot faster, or there's one person that's seems a lot nicer or whatever, and you're like, oh, I want to navigate this system so that I like end up with, technically they're doing the same job, you're filling out the same forms, you're going through the same process, but the experience is different. And I've seen this a lot, in like sometimes when behavioral scientists are choosing what projects to focus on, they might skew towards something that's a little bit easier, like a digital platform or a product where it's a somewhat uniform delivery mechanism, because like the more people that are involved at the front lines, and it's just so it gets noisier, right? So what's been your experience, introducing this concept to organizations? Do they sort of understand it intuitively? Do they need convincing? And then are they willing to do things about it or not?
Lots of great questions. It's kind of reminding me of when we wrote that HBR piece and it came out it was October 2016. We were convinced that we would be getting all these calls of people who wanted to work with Danny and our team on noise audits. we got like zero. Like, I don't remember a single one coming in. And well, we'll see if people want to work on this now. I have brought it up over the past 3 years as I've taught it in class, and I bring it up with clients. It's an idea that I think people hear and they resonate and they've experienced it either on the customer side of things in their own life, or in the management side of things, or even experiencing it for themselves professionally, knowing that at different points in time they've made judgments differently. But it's really hard, I think, to convince people to do these noise audits, partly because the way we've been talking about them to date is often very technical. Who likes the word audit, right? That's a terrible word, right? It sounds boring and hard and not fun. And often in like these bigger companies that have distributed teams, like you're talking, there isn't as much psychological safety to, find error and failure, right? You want to give the solution. I get it, right? You're rewarded for fixing things. You're rewarded for making things better. You're not really rewarded for pointing out like glaring error that no one has been seeing, this inconsistency between, let's say, frontline workers that might be undermining the ability to serve all customers equally, fairly, and accurately. So what I've been trying to do, and honestly with the course, on the section where we talk about noise audits, we certainly reflect the core ideas that we worked on with Danny and in the book, but the whole spin is around making it easy and real, relatable, making it feel fair, and making it feel useful. So I want to empower people to actually see that you can do this yourself. You don't need a lot of math. The math is relatively straightforward. And there are ways to do it that reduce sort of the risk involved. So for instance, I think if you really want to try this, but you're worried you don't have that psychological safety, you should run it as basically an experiment where half the people go through the noise audit exercise as we normally would and would write out in these articles. And the other half of people go through it, but you also add decision hygiene techniques, which is, the broad umbrella term for how to reduce noise and fix error generally. So by running the audit, you're also testing out solutions. So you can say, hey, this is how much of that variability exists today that's unwanted, undesired. But we know we can reduce half of it merely by implementing this checklist or independent assessment or whatever the other techniques you might have tried. And so we talk about that in the course, because that is really the pushback I've gotten when I've taught this and talked with clients about it is, hey, yeah, I know this is a problem, but no one's going to reward me for rooting it out. And I'm going to look bad for not having noticed it before, because noise is hard to notice. And so you're almost doing an audit on yourself. I wouldn't voluntarily do that. So the goal is to make it, easy, relatable, impactful for people right away.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I hadn't really thought about it until you just said that, but audit is a terrible word. It's like you get like tax audited. Like there's no upside to an audit.
Wait to be audited.
It's like you either squeak by or you get in trouble.
Exactly. It has bad connotations.
It's painful through the whole process.
Yeah. So my head, I think, went exactly where what you described, which is like, oh, if you're a customer, I could see you wanting to do it. If you're a manager, I could see you wanting to do it. But if you're the frontline worker yourself, why would you ever want it? I wonder if there's a way of kind of empowering. I'll maybe an example is I kind of felt this way when I mentioned like having that feeling about our behavioral kind of design process of like, well, it's probably pretty variable, like depending on which behavioral scientist you get, what type of intervention is designed, And so, we built like a tool to kind of help mitigate that a little bit. And the idea wasn't necessarily to standardize things, but it was to sort of say, hey, consider all these, similar to what you described of a checklist. It was like, consider these elements. These are things that we think are probably important based on the type of thing you're trying to solve. And then, maintaining the designer sort of maintained autonomy to disregard anything or say, well, based on my expertise, I think that I want to go in this other direction. But it at least sort of prompted people to be thinking about some of this stuff instead of just sort of going to like, oh, I always use this particular type of, intervention. And that's just the one because of availability, the one that comes to mind more quickly. And I'm probably going to use more often.
What's interesting here is you didn't mention that you went in to see if there was variability among behavioral designers. And I completely share that concern. In fact, even in academia, right, you give people the same theoretical problem and the stimuli and paradigms they design are completely different. But you didn't measure, you didn't audit, right? You skipped the audit, you just assumed it was there and moved to decision hygiene, which I don't think there's a problem with that. I think the audit is useful for people who need to make the business case for investing in these sort of decision hygiene techniques of structure, of more guardrails and rules to keep people autonomous, but give them boundaries within which to have and exercise that autonomy, and better scales and all that. So some people might want to just skip to fixes, and that's totally fine. Other people know that that's going to take time and energy with that they need to actually budget for, and so running at least a partial audit can help make that case.
So maybe as we're talking about the application, it's a good transition to talk about the course and how, maybe we can start by thinking about how the course came to be. And I know you were kind of you've been involved in the concept of noise for a long time, from the HBO article, and you helped out with the book as well. So maybe let's start by thinking about what the process was of deciding to turn this into a course and how to go about it. And then we can start talking a little bit more about, how this translates into a course and how that's different from a book and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I had been teaching this material as soon as I was on the project. So I started working with Danny and Olivier and then Cass. 2018 was when it all started, Q1. And I was already teaching at Chicago Booth and doing exec ed. And I just started later in that year, workshopping some of the material in front of students, which was kind of nice for the authors because they weren't always teaching at the time. Olivier workshop material too, and we could bring back our feedback. Yeah, exactly. Say, okay, this is the way we're thinking about things. I remember even trying it out on clients too, and it was, it's all good material, but it really helped to say, okay, this is a way of saying the targets work, right? We know that the targets work really well, but are there other words, framings, examples that are really resonating with different types of professional students? And so I found when I first started teaching it, there were a lot of, challenges, like I mentioned with the audit, even with the topic of noise. And I remember giving a talk with CFOs, people who are, very used to dealing with numbers and math and technicalities. And even them felt like the idea was just too technical and abstract. Bias is so easy to see. We can read patterns everywhere. That's what we're programmed to do. Trying to tell people to focus on the background noise effectively is really hard. And so I kept getting that feedback. I kept getting feedback like, a lot of these examples, it's about medicine. It's about the judicial system. How about, me? I don't have necessarily this large set of frontline workers. How about my decisions tomorrow in these meetings? How does it relate? And then I also got feedback that, hey, this is all intellectually stimulating, but so what? What am I going to do next? And so as I continued to teach these exec ed and MBA courses, I tried new material out, informed by the book and my own sort of experiments. And so as the book was coming out this year, not all the material I used to teach is in the book. Not all the book material is in what I teach. It kind of made sense to put out a course that allowed people to have that multimodal way of learning, right? You can read the book and then you can have some of the core concepts reinforced with different examples, interactive exercises, more personal anecdotes. And it's simplified, right? The book is going to be really detailed. It goes into a lot of the technicalities, awesome, amazing examples. The course is necessarily going to be quicker, bite-sized. Here's the main thing you need to know. And so necessarily simplifies things. I don't think it dumbs it down, but it's very selective on what it picks up. And so kind of like when I teach in class and I assign a book, you can kind of think about the class in that way. You can read the book to help enforce the material, but you don't have to read the book to understand the course. And the course is in no way repetitive with the book.
Did you have any specific audiences in mind for the course that may be different from the book or complement the book? Or have you thought about kind of your end users?
I kind of had my husband in mind, actually. Jokes aside, he's extremely smart. He's I actually think he's smarter than me. He beat me on the GMAT, which I will never forgive him for. Just barely, but he beat me.
Maybe you see to retake it and see if he can overtake.
Yeah, he's super smart. But he doesn't read. He doesn't have time to read. He's super busy, maybe as busy as me. And reading is not his go-to thing, let alone reading, a large nonfiction book. He listens to quick podcasts. He listens to quick things on the go when he walks from his apartment to work. And so I honestly designed it for people like that in mind. People who are intellectually curious, want to learn about the latest in behavioral science, stay up to date, incorporate it into their worlds, but don't have a ton of time. And so every video every module is less than 10 minutes. Basically your commute. You don't necessarily have to watch the screen for all of it to resonate. It could just be audio, although I'm hoping that the animations and the images are fun. And we tried to embed it with humor.
You'll miss the dog disappearance.
You'll miss the dogs and my poor dogs. They hate me. We tried to make it sticky. So again, your imaginary person like my husband walking to work or driving to work, they listen to one module, they get one core idea that sticks. That's been explained through different examples, stories, hopefully gets a little bit of a laugh. And so it actually retains over time. And I've done enough teaching to know that if I put too much material into a lecture, no matter how long or short it is, in one ear, out the other. So it's really trying to get everybody to learn at least one thing per module, and then they can go on with their day and hopefully start folding it in.
That's a really interesting concept, and this makes me think about, maybe in general behavioral science, that's something we need to think about a little more often, is how do we reach more people in different scenarios? Because most stuff, it's either podcasts or it's books. Books are obviously the primary way, or academic papers, and then we have podcasts and stuff. But it's just, I think it's like a different avenue for a different type of person that wants to learn, but wants it very structured, very targeted. And it seems like it's probably an opportunity that as a field we can kind of think of more, is how do we reach people that aren't necessarily listening to the Action Design podcast every month, although they should.
They should.
Or don't have time to read the books or academic papers and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting idea that I think we should probably explore more generally as a field. I
agree. And I will tell you right now that this course isn't perfect. If it was perfect, I would be worried I haven't found the perfection yet. So I'm hoping to also get feedback from people who take it and have, ways that we can improve it, make it stickier, make it even simpler or more useful for people. Because that's really what we're aiming for, and intend to hopefully do more going forward.
I like that you also sort of put out some guidance around who shouldn't take it or reasons to not take the course. So that's maybe worth kind of talking through as well.
Oh, yeah. Not everyone. Well, if you don't like the sound of my voice, please don't take the course. Because for this first one, it's all me. In subsequent courses, I want my whole team doing it. If you don't like dogs, there's a lot of dogs in there, partly for humor. And who doesn't like dogs? And, it's not there to teach you the math. I reread the book. I got it right here when it came out and, marked up, what do we actually repeat? We don't repeat a ton. Yeah, we use the targets. We talk about bias and noise, but there's a ton of content in this book that we're not covering. So if you're looking for a one-to-one replacement of the book, please don't treat the course in that way. I think people will be sorely disappointed if they do that. If people are looking for a technical certification, either we're not trying to give you a degree in noise. This is really for your intellectually curious professional who doesn't have a ton of time to dig into the details, but wants to stay up to date and to actually use what they're learning.
And I know you just sort of mentioned a moment ago, the course isn't perfect. If it was perfect, you'd be looking for that. I'm curious if you, over the course of sort of building this, noticed or identified the sort of errors and judgment, whether they're sort of biases or noise in yourself or in the design and the work that you're doing. I know that you've given a few examples of it in the past. So I'm curious if you noticed that as you're doing the work with this as well.
Oh, yeah. So much error, so much. I remember we started working on it in September and we were like, we'll have this ready to go in December. And we are just finishing up the final touches right now on the edits. So huge planning fallacy. That's a shared bias by all of us. But we also had noise in that I think that some of us who shall remain unnamed, i.e. me, had more planning fallacy than others. And so there's a little bit of noise, right? The different degrees of bias that we shared. But gosh, I'd say there were two moments that I was really thinking, oh my God, how noisy is my judgment? And one happened when we were writing like the scripts, because for this first one we transcribed it and had cue cards so that the wording was right. And I remember I had written a draft and then I sent it to Yumi, who you met, who's running the show here, really running all of our product work. And she looked at it and then she sent a draft back. And then I critiqued, I think there was some word, overwhelmed, I think it was. I was like, I wouldn't use this word here. And she wrote me back. She's like, that was your word. You wrote that. And I'm like, oh, damn it. Darn it. There I go. Like, changing your mind is one thing, but to some extent, having the strong belief that this is the wrong word on one day and like writing it the other day, just kind of showed how noisy I was. And then literally a week ago, I was watching a video in a new animation that we had with like the rare bit of math in it. And I realized that for 2 months, this one example I was using where I think I was subtracting, I said 85 minus 60. What's 85 minus 60? What do you guys think? Never do math live, Gandhi. It's 25, yeah.
My initial answer was going to be 15, though.
Yeah.
I know, right? Doesn't it feel like it should be 15? I had written 15. I had said 15. My whole team had like watched these videos and edited it. And then last week I was watching this animator we got that's great, had put it on screen, and I was like, oh my God, it's not 15. So we had to retape the whole thing. And so anyone who actually does the course will notice in the building algorithms video, when we have an animation up with 85 and 60 in a subtraction sign, you will hear my voice is very different. And it sounds strange, right? Because my voice was taped in one room for the majority of the course. And then we had to retape the audio and snip it in. So we will be making fun of ourselves for that. So that was a major error. And I don't know if I want to chalk it up. There's a bit of bias there and probably just noisiness and how, aware our attention is all the time. So yeah, lots of errors in it. I'm sure there will be errors we don't catch and kind students will point out to us. I should say, before I forget, I always forget. If any of your listeners want a special little offer, we put together a discount code just for you guys. It's Action Design 75. So you get $75 off the course if you use that code Action Design 75.
And that's great. It's not Action Design 85 minus.
No,
there's no
don't
math
make
involved.
it joke like that. I know. It was so
Impossible
mortifying.
to screw up.
Yeah.
I've definitely had those errors where like I write something or it's in a presentation, I'll go through it a bunch of times and look at like the 5th time, I'm just like, how did I miss that? Like so many times. Like,
and it's like that's the bias.
So interesting.
The systematic tendency is that you don't notice everything, right? Change blindness, limited attention, limited memory. We know that, but the content of what you miss varies over time, right? It could be random, it could be systematic, but it's hard to know in each instance. And random variability injected in the systematic tendency to miss stuff means that different times you miss different things, and there's our noise.
It's interesting as you think about like if you're like editing it and going through, because other people that are on your team might have looked through it, but they're not necessarily looking for like math checks. They're just looking for typos and things like that. So like I could easily see I could be reviewing something, I wouldn't even double check that because I'm just like, oh, I'm looking for misstated things or spelling errors and stuff, when like there's these other things that could go wrong as well that you're not thinking about. That's kind of a good example of like omission bias.
Exactly. No, you're spot on. And so Yumi and I sat down 3 weeks ago and we started noticing those things happening. And by the way, still you can see it wasn't perfect. And we actually used decision hygiene. We were like, okay, we're going to set up a process of independent assessment. We're going to set up a checklist of what to look for, how to look for it. It did slow us down a little bit, but I'm gosh hopeful that we've caught all the errors now by using better decision hygiene to reduce error.
I'm still fully on the team that math should just feel right, though. So
yeah.
I like the example of like the overwhelmed, like that term, because that happens to me pretty frequently as well. And I think what I've started to notice about myself, at least this has been my interpretation of it, is that I've gotten used to just producing opinions about things when an opinion is not really required. And so like, if I'm looking over, a draft that, either I've written or maybe somebody else has written, I'm like, well, I wouldn't write it this way. And so I start to change things. And then I'm like, well, but does that matter? Does it matter that it's not written the way that I would write it? And I'm like, does it still get the point across? Does it still, and it's like, well, yeah, it still does all those things. And there's been more than one occasion recently, I'd say within the past 18 months or so, where I've kind of checked myself and just removed the edits that I've started to put in on something, because I'm like, this isn't really this isn't something that requires an opinion or my additional input. It's just like, it's kind of fine as it is.
It's an opinion where we would expect variability, right? It's a preference. It isn't that you absolutely, you would expect different authors to write something differently. And therefore, the variability we see is often, adaptive. If your version of it or the other person's version of it doesn't get read, well, great, that's signal from the world and they won't, be writing more articles. Or vice versa. If your, article takes off, that's feedback that it's better. But often the problem with the noisiness and inconsistency is that we don't have a marketplace to, audit and flag it, right? If you go to a doctor and they give you one diagnosis about, oh, this is what you have, Zarak, you're not going to go to 100 other doctors and find out if they're right or wrong. And so I think your example is perfect because it's very easy to think all variability is bad. It's absolutely not. If you're in a situation where similar cases ought to be treated similarly, that's where we have often the problem of noise, and there's no market mechanism to compete out and find the best thing. There's no way of crowdsourcing the best thing. That's when you have noise.
Well, it's also, relevant to just science in general and the way that science is communicated. And that I think, especially when people read articles about this study says this thing, and people say oh, science is supposed to be this definitive statement of how the world is, when in reality it's very messy and there's a ton of disagreement among scientists looking at the same data. But as a layperson, it's really hard to sift through that. And I think we've seen that especially through COVID, where we're watching science happen in real time. And it's very conflicting, and it's just really challenging it's sort of interesting idea to apply this concept of noise, about how we communicate these kind of things too, to say that all right, this one study that says X causes Y is not necessarily definitive in the answer. There's also a lot of conflicting opinions about this. This is why it might be different. And, we're all busy and cognitively limited to think through oh, not everything I read is just perfectly sound, 100% confident, right? So it's really just a challenge of interpreting the world in some kind of way and how we share findings in real time.
But thankfully, there's Twitter.
Oh, no.
All the answers are.
I mean,
where
you're
all
totally
the answers
right,
are.
Though I thought when I started my PhD a year ago, I was like, oh, thank gosh, I'm leaving business for some of my time and doing some more stuff with academics, and science is truth, right? Science is consistent. And I have just been, I should have known, I didn't, just how many degrees of freedom there are in the way that you design research. And I mean, for me, the real hang up every time I design something is the stimulus, or the paradigm to use when you're trying to test a theory. If I were trying to test, just something basic, how much do people want to pay for products? And is there a bias around that or some noise? Which products do I put in my paper? Do I pick coffee? Do I pick movies? Do I pick houses? I know there's no right answer necessarily. And there's a lot of opinions on how to do stimulus sampling. But at the end of the day, it just feels so arbitrary and really, really, really tough. So science is imperfect for sure. Like all humans, like me building a course.
Well, Speaking of science and COVID and figuring things out in real time, you've got some interesting projects that are going on in real time right now. I think one of them launched just the day before we started recording this. So I think it'll be interesting for some action design folks to hear about those as well, because I know some folks participated in a survey, I think, that you ran earlier this year or late last year. And I think that has informed some of your other work. So maybe, I don't know, talk us through some of the interesting kind of COVID related projects that you're doing.
I'd love to. And so many thanks out to listeners who participated in that survey. I really appreciate it. So part of what I'm focusing on in my studies, or the research program I'm really interested in, is how to do science at scale with real problems, with real people, with real impact. I love lab studies for sure, but I'm very passionate about the dependent variable, the thing we're trying to influence, being something out in the real world that's meaningful. And so I've had the great fortune to work with the Behavior Change for Good initiative run by Katie Melkman and Angela Duckworth at Penn, where they've done a couple of these mega studies to measure multiple treatments, multiple psychological ideas, let's say, against each other. So not just an A/B test, but like an A, B, C, D, E, F, G test all the way through 40 interventions, just in some cases, to really see what works and why in applied settings. So the one that your listeners might be somewhat familiar with was a project related to vaccinations, not COVID, but had in some implications. It was around the flu vaccine. And how can we nudge people to get the flu vaccine, particularly during flu season? And this was run in the fall through the early winter of this past flu season. And many different awesome research teams designed these interventions. I didn't design any of them. I am not, no credit to me for some of the really cool ideas they came up with. I was really interested in the prediction part of it. How well can we predict which of these interventions will work? We meaning everyday people, we meaning researchers who designed them themselves, and we meaning behavioral science practitioners or enthusiasts, which included your listeners. And so we were able to send out a survey to your listeners and other practitioners to see if they could predict which of these messages would boost flu vaccination rates the most across a specific sample of people in the US, partnering with Penn Med and Geisinger in Pennsylvania region. So that, just to jog memory, that was one of the main studies. I should say everything I talk about around prediction, none of it's been published. We're still looking on how to use it, but I can talk about the messages themselves. And it was really fascinating to see which ones worked best and whether they shared any attributes underlying them. So, there's one way to study this to say, hey, this was the winner. If you had a choice, this is our best case of what you should use for other vaccinations, maybe for COVID, although of course the context is different. Another way to look at it is to say, if I were to code all of the dimensions of these like the attributes, like how long is the text message? What's the grammar being used? Like, is it telling you to do something? Is it asking you questions? How often are these messages going out? That was what I was really interested in looking at. And, the general gist of what we find, again, this is an exploratory part of the research, though, it wasn't pre-registered, was it seems like, if you implicitly default people into getting a flu vaccine, you kind of assume, hey, you're going to get the flu vaccine. This is just a reminder. This is just a simple nudge, no other bells and whistles. But that sort of vibe of like a reminder nudge saying you already need to do this, I'm just reminding you, that tendency seemed to work best across all the different messages that went out. And so for me, just reflecting on that and thinking, to your point, Zarak, of how different people design different things in behavioral science context and practice, it made me think, I wonder if we all love temptation bundling and ease of recall, and I don't know, we spit out any cool, psychological concept, but sometimes like the easiest, like making it easy, making it simple, assuming people mean to do the right thing, like maybe that's what often is the thing we should start with, rather than trying to pull out, the latest and greatest fun concept.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting insight. And it's one that it comes up a lot in conversation, because I think people often think that all behavior change problems are motivation problems, or at least that's the first thing people think of. Not necessarily behavioral scientists, I guess, but like in general, people think, oh, how can we motivate people? How can we incentivize people? And while it's good to always consider all options and think about that stuff, in a lot of cases, unless it's sort of obvious that you have got like people that are openly antagonistic, like a lot of people that are antagonistic, it's maybe useful to just start from an assumption that it's a bell curve, and there's some people that are going to be first in line for vaccines and waiting outside the door. And there's going to be a lot of people that are just like, yeah, I'll get it when I get it, or, and so increasing their sort of ability to do it, or making it easier, reducing friction or whatever, can be effective and still influence people that are behind them on the bell curve, So it's not just like a fixed point in time, but as more and more people start to adopt, the new behavior, people continue to shift. So it's it's an interesting, and yeah, I think great approach. I am very curious as well about your prediction results that you end up getting.
I will share they're not perfect, but I think that will surprise no one.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't, what I would be interested in learning or seeing is if and this might be like too much to extrapolate from this study, but a lot of times, we're trying to figure out how far down the list should we go? We've got lots of ideas. Should we just do an A/B test, or can we add other versions in there? Where should we sort of stop? Not just for sort of statistical reasons, but kind of for theoretical reasons as well, or so it would be interesting to see like, if you can test 3 or if you can test 5, like your best ideas are going to be in there, or no, it's totally random. And it's like, you're just not good at guessing these at all,
No, I mean, I love that. Like the motivation for me of this topic, which again, I said, it's very work in progress and goes beyond this flu study, is just like, what is driving our intuitions as behavioral designers? Whether you're, more on the UX side of things or you're really embedded in the research, what are the things that we get excited about designing, and is that excitement well placed? Is sort of our need to explain and have this, it's like just surprising enough finding? Is that overwhelming maybe a reality where, like you mentioned, just trying to assume people mean to do the right thing and make it easy for them and make it simple? Are we kind of getting in our own way there because we have this amazing toolkit available to us? That's kind of, I guess it's a little inside baseball of me. I hope I don't end up going that direction too much, but it bothers me a lot as a practitioner. And so I'm hope I can find something that helps us know when to go with those fun bells and whistles and when to, really stick to just the basics.
I'll say, like, I'm not sure that's even a bias just of like expertise in behavioral design. Like, even when I'm working with people to apply behavioral stuff, I find like people always want to jump to like the fun, new, exciting thing. And they're like, oh, like let's implement like machine learning to figure out this problem or something like that. I'm just like, how about we just like make it easier for people to like find what they want, what you want them to do on the website? Like, how about we just like remove some steps first and let's see how that helps. So there's somewhat of like just a bias of, I think in general, we think that simple isn't good enough to fix a problem in some ways. And I think sometimes that can be worse with expertise because like, we're so excited about all these big ideas that we're like, oh, we want to try all these different things. But I think it's kind of a natural human bias as well to just assume that the simple solution can't be the issue for whatever reason, or can't be the solution.
I feel like we're like straying into the territory of probably one of our future guests, Leidy Klotz, and his book Subtract. I feel like this is kind of one of the ideas there of like
segue,
removing things, simplicity. But you'll have to wait for that, listeners.
Yeah. One thing, just to piggyback on Erik, and just to hearken to what you mentioned, Zarak, about COVID research, I am excited that, the day before taping this, the same group, the BCFG group, was able to work with the city of Philadelphia to launch the first city-based lottery to really help encourage citizens to get vaccinated in Philly. And I'm sure our listeners are aware of those going on in California, and Ohio, and New York. This one's Philadelphia specific, and we tried to, make it simple, really take the best of the science on how to encourage behavior change, make it easy for people to sign up for this lottery, make it easy for them to get vaccinated as much as we can, and just assume that everyone means well and wants to do the right thing. It's just, you can't take time off of work, or it's been hard to get around to it, and just hope that the way that these really awesome lottery incentives are designed help people take that final step, right? Get to the end of the bell curve, as you mentioned, Zarak, and really get vaccinated and help with the health of the city, particularly the most underserved groups and regions.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And I saw a little kind of peek of the different sort of science-based elements that are included in there. And it was very fun to see so many ideas from behavioral science incorporated into that. So very excited to see the impact of that as well.
Yes, yeah, we're going to focus on making sure we can measure, the impact on vaccination rates and looking at surrounding areas so that we can really help not just Philadelphia, but really the whole nation as everybody is trying to get people vaccinated.
Well, that's a good segue to close out and say, for keeping up with, finding the course and keeping up with cool findings of studies like that in the future, how can our listeners best keep track of your work, keep up to date with things like that, all that sort of thing?
Oh, that's funny. I'm terrible at social media. I'm trying to get better, but I do have a handle at Linnea Gandhi and Twitter. If you're really interested in behavior change for good, I would encourage following the Behavior Change for Good initiative run by Katie Milkman and Angela Duckworth. For the course,
highly recommend.
You can go to our website or our Teachable page, behavioralsight.com. And please, if you do want to sign up, which we'd love you to do, you can use the code ActionDesign75 and give us feedback, because we know there will be errors we haven't caught.
Spot the noise.
Yeah, spot the noise.
Spot the noise, get a prize maybe.
Yeah.
Combine it all. Awesome.
Thank you.
Love it. Well, thank you, Linnea, for joining us. Always up to such interesting work. And so I'm excited to check out the course. And I got a sneak peek at a couple different lessons, and they were awesome. And yeah, we'll excited to probably chat with you again soon about some other fun work that you're doing.
Book.
The chapter that you wrote for our book too. So awesome. Well, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Cool. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.